On the morning of March 29, 1945, American soldiers moved through a valley on Tokashiki Island as part of the opening phase of the Okinawa campaign. Scattered around them were 150 dead and dying Okinawan civilians. Japanese soldiers had armed them with grenades, told them that American capture meant rape and death, and ordered them to kill themselves and their families rather than surrender. But many of the soldiers who had armed the civilians survived, and Tokashiki was not the only place this happened. The same pattern repeated itself in several other areas throughout the Battle of Okinawa. So why did Japanese troops give its civilians grenades rather than a way out? And why did Major Yutaka Umezawa, one of those surviving Japanese military commanders, later stand in a Japanese courtroom and argue that the civilians had chosen death freely? The civilians who died in that valley had been prepared for that end by Japanese society for decades before the war. When Japan took control of Okinawa in 1879, loyalty to the emperor and sacrifice for the nation were embedded as the core obligations of civic life. Then in January 1941, War Minister Hideki Tojo signed the Field Service Code, which ordered soldiers to die rather than surrender. So surrender was not just a disgrace for Japanese soldiers, it was also a crime. But then in November 1944, the Japanese military extended that code to civilians as well, issuing a directive stating that soldiers and civilians must live and die together as the island braced for the American invasion. So C-rating squadrons, which were suicide boat units built to attack the American fleet, moved into the Kerama Islands, a small island group 15 miles west of Okinawa, and displaced the civilian administration. The garrison commander became the supreme authority on each island, and village officials who had previously managed local life now transmitted his orders directly to the civilian population. The civilians had not enlisted in Japan's war, but Japan had enlisted them anyway. 1 week before the American landings, soldiers from Colonel Yoshitsugu Akamatsu's garrison on Tokashiki distributed 2 grenades each to members of the village youth organizations and island office staff, one to throw at the enemy and one to use on themselves. The Americans had to take the Kerama Islands before the main invasion of Okinawa to ensure the suicide boats never reached the invading American fleet. When the U.S. 77th Infantry Division landed on March 26, 1945, the Japanese garrison numbered nearly 1,000 personnel, although the majority were Korean laborers with no combat experience. The defenders offered sporadic resistance before retreating to high ground, and of the 300 suicide boats the Japanese had positioned on the islands, 4 attempted to attack the American fleet and failed. All other boats were seized. On Tokashiki, the largest of the Kerama Islands, the soldiers in the garrison had retreated into the island interior, but the civilians they had armed remained on the island, and they still had their orders to kill and be killed. The following night on March 27th, Japanese soldiers from Colonel Akamatsu's garrison ordered Tokashiki civilians to move after dark toward the garrison's inland camp, but did not tell them why. Among those ordered to move that night was Kinjo Shigeaki, a 16-year-old Okinawan boy. He recalled soldiers ordering them to travel unseen, and so for 5 hours in heavy rain, between 700 and 1,000 civilians traveled through the darkness. They arrived to find themselves surrounded by Japanese soldiers. Women and children were already crying. The village head ordered the crowd to shout, "Banzai," the cry Japanese soldiers made before dying on the battlefield. And then soldiers began moving through the crowd, handing out grenades and showing the civilians how to detonate them. But there were not enough for everyone, and Kinjo's family received none. Although the moment those grenades changed hands was the signal to begin, not against the Americans, but against themselves. What then followed spread from one family to the next, using grenades, clubs, scythes, stones, knives, and ropes, each killing, triggering another. Kinjo and his older brother first killed their mother with stones, then their younger brother and sister. Around them, the screaming continued until the violence stopped. But Kinjo and his brother did not kill each other. Instead, they walked away from the massacre and the first person they encountered in the island's interior was a Japanese soldier, alive and unharmed. They had been told that soldiers and civilians would live and die together, but the soldier had not died. Kinjo later said that in that moment, he was no longer willing to commit suicide, so he and his brother fled and hid in the mountains, surviving on shellfish and food cans left behind by American soldiers. While below them, the Americans moved through the Valley of the Dead. They were later found by an American soldier and taken to Tokashiki village, where they were given food. Kinjo had been told American capture meant rape and death, but it meant neither. He spent the rest of his life with a phrase for what the Japanese military had done: the army survives, the people die. If you want to know how that phrase ended up in a Japanese courtroom, like this video and subscribe, and stay with us to see how this story ends. Tokashiki was not the only island where this happened. Across several of the Kerama Islands, the same pattern repeated. On Zamami, 171 civilians died in group deaths under Major Umezawa's command, and on Kerama, there were similar deaths under the same military coercion. The Kerama Islands were secured by March 29th, 3 days before the main invasion of Okinawa began. Then on April 1st, 1945, the Americans landed on Okinawa itself, and as the battle moved across the island, civilians died in their thousands. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, whose 32nd Army of more than 100,000 troops had orders to hold the island at all costs, inflicting maximum casualties on the Americans in order to buy more time for the defense of the Japanese mainland. Ushijima anchored that defense along the Shuri line and held the Americans there for nearly 2 months. But when Ushijima ordered withdrawal south in late May, his retreating soldiers moved through the most densely populated parts of the island. And as they fell back, the Japanese troops turned on the civilians around them. Okinawans suspected of passing information to the Americans were executed on the spot. Then in the final weeks of the battle, as American forces swept through the south of the island, a 7-year-old Okinawan girl named Tomiko Higa emerged from the caves, where she had spent weeks alone in hiding after being separated from her family. She was carrying a white flag made from a stick and a piece of cloth, and a U.S. Army photographer captured the moment that American soldiers reached her. She was not harmed. She was cared for. And it was here that the propaganda the Japanese military had used to drive its civilians towards suicide was shown, in its most direct form, to have been a lie. On June 22nd, General Ushijima committed ritual suicide rather than surrender, and the remaining organized Japanese defense of Okinawa ended with him. The Battle of Okinawa was officially declared over on July 2nd, 1945, 92 days after the first Americans had landed. Of the more than 100,000 troops Ushijima had commanded, fewer than 7,400 had been taken prisoner. The rest were dead. Post-war estimates placed total Okinawan civilian deaths at approximately 150,000, nearly 1/3 of the island's entire population, killed through bombardment, starvation, disease, execution by Japanese troops, and coerced group deaths. In the years after the battle, the Kerama deaths were documented by Okinawan journalists and survivors. A mainland Japanese novelist, Kenzaburō Ōe, who would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1994, brought that account to a national audience. He had visited Okinawa and spoken with multiple civilian survivors, and in 1970, he published Okinawa Notes, a book which described the Japanese military as responsible for civilian deaths across the Battle of Okinawa, including specifically the deaths on the Kerama Islands. Ōe didn't name either garrison commander, not Colonel Akamatsu, who had commanded Tokashiki, nor Major Umezawa, who had commanded Zamami. But 35 years later, in August 2005, Umezawa and the relatives of the deceased Colonel Akamatsu filed a defamation lawsuit against Ōe and his publisher in this Osaka District Court, demanding the account of the Kerama deaths be suppressed and the book taken out of print. The case moved through the Osaka District Court across 2005 and 2006. Umezawa and the relatives of Akamatsu testified that the Kerama residents had chosen death freely, dying, they said, with beautiful hearts. But survivors who appeared before the court said otherwise. Among them was Kinjo Shigeaki, the 16-year-old who had killed his mother and siblings on Tokashiki in March 1945, and who, in the years after the war, had gone on to become an educator and public figure in Okinawa. Now, in his mid-70s, he testified that the Japanese military had coerced the civilians of Tokashiki into killing themselves and their families. Other survivors from Tokashiki told reporters afterward that they could not allow the rewriting of history. But on March 30th, 2007, while the lawsuit remained unresolved, that is exactly what Japan's Ministry of Education attempted to do, announcing revisions to 7 high school history textbooks that would remove all references to Japanese military coercion in descriptions of the Okinawan group deaths. The passages to be removed were specific, those that said residents had been driven into mass suicide by the Japanese military. The ministry's stated reasoning was that a specific military order to die could not be verified. The replacement wording would acknowledge that deaths had occurred, but would not say the military had caused them. The announcement produced the largest public protest Okinawa had seen in decades. On September 29, 2007, 110,000 people demonstrated in Genoa City, and from across the island, elected representatives demanded the decision be reversed. By December 2007, the ministry had retreated, but only partially. Textbooks could now acknowledge military involvement, but the word coercion, the term that assigned direct responsibility, remained excluded. It was now for the Osaka District Court to decide. On March 28, 2008, Judge Fukami Toshimasa of the Osaka District Court delivered his verdict. He found that Japanese soldiers had distributed grenades to civilians and told them to die rather than be captured, and that group deaths had occurred only where Japanese forces had been stationed. Because of this, it was reasonable to believe it had ordered the deaths. So the lawsuit was dismissed in its entirety. Umezawa and the relatives of Akamatsu appealed twice, but both appeals failed. The question was never whether Okinawan civilians died. It was whether people given grenades by their own military, ordered to kill themselves and their families rather than surrender, and told that American capture meant rape and death could ever be said to have chosen death freely. The court found that the military had distributed those grenades, issued those orders, and been present at every site where group deaths occurred. But it stopped short of finding that Colonel Akamatsu or Major Umezawa had personally given the order to die. The military's role was confirmed, but the commander's individual responsibility was not. If this video interested you, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to find out what happened to the man who ran Japan's biological warfare research and ordered human experimentation during World War II, that video is on screen now.